So welcome everybody to this session, and I'm really happy to be here and to serve as a discussant for a presentation by Ms. Paula Garcia and about the Acequia and Land Grant Education Project, or the Land, Water, Justice, and Food Sovereignty Project. And they're going to, this is kind of a workshop situation in which they would like to do a presentation and then get some ideas from you, correct?
Sure, and we'd love to field questions as well, Dr. Martinez. So if, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, buen día a todos. Good morning to all of you. You don't know how truly honored and privileged I feel, and truly we're all privileged, right, in a lot of different ways with what we've been sharing and to be able to meet in this fashion. But it's even more so for me. And I'd like to, in my own humble capacity, share, at least a salutation in one of the languages that I'm mildly connected to, and that I had the luxury of attempting to learn while I was at UNM. And so, Adrian Sandoval. It's a pleasure to be with all of you once again. And so, my name is Adrian. I am the current director of the Center for the Education and Study of Diverse Populations. I will invite Paula to introduce herself as well. Paula, please.
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Paula Garcia, and I'm honored to share this time with all of you and to be speaking with Adrian Sandoval from Highlands University. I work with the New Mexico Acequia Association, and we're a grassroots organization. It's a nonprofit that focuses on protecting water as a community resource and strengthening and affirming our land-based and agricultural traditions. And we've done that through community education and policy advocacy. And we've created a lot of very meaningful relationships with Pueblo and tribal farmers around issues of common interest and common history, including seeds and protecting clean water in different coalitions that we've also helped to co-found with Indigenous organizations. So our work around youth education is something that will be discussed today. And I'm just very honored to be here. Thank you very much, Dr. Martinez, and looking forward to being here with you.
All right, thank you, Paula. And so, as you can see from the very get-go, even with the title, it's a recognition that there are multiple ways to view the intent of the Acequia Land Grant Education Project. One of my first conversations that I had with Paula was just how are we going to approach the intricacies, the realities of land and water in New Mexico within this project, and how are we going to be inclusive of the communities that we have within Mexico in a way that I guess shows and displays justice and humility. And one of the things that I found just wonderful about Paula's response was not only absolutely, but also there's no ownership of what ultimately the curriculum needs to be called. There's no ownership of what ultimately needs to be taught specifically. Each community can take the parameters of the curriculum and shift it to make it be what it needs to be, and to be inclusive of the narratives that need to be there. And so with that, I'd like to proceed now to just kind of an overview of the objectives of our conversation this morning, which will definitely try to honor your voice as well and your questions, because I'm sure there will be some. The first and foremost is to position the ALGE project within the critical race theory system, right? To make sure that we understand that it does reside there, and it's a question, and it resides there for multiple people and multiple reasons, although those reasons may be complex. It's also to reflect on the rationale for the ALGE project with both humility and honesty. Again, getting to that notion of how complex this conversation truly is. And the third objective is to consider the implications of such a curriculum in each of our communities, right? As I was mentioning, as I was alluding to a little bit earlier, and how can we make this curriculum our own, or perhaps we already have one, and how do we begin to engage in conversation of expanding or sharing ideas and thoughts and collaborating in ways that support our young people ultimately to grow up, to be responsible, to be thoughtful, to be advocates, to own their narratives around land and water and food sovereignty in the United States and of course in our region. And then lastly, we would love for you to ponder recommendations around what you feel should be thought of within the context of this project. And we'd love to record those recommendations and honor that voice that's being shared. As we transition now towards our conversation with this thought about tribal crit, right? Critical race theory and Latino CRT, I just want to mention that really neither of these are mutually exclusive, right? There's not a contention with one over the other. It doesn't have to be the idea of really the push and pull. When we think about CRTs, it's really about mobilizing from the intersections of racism, and it doesn't need to initiate some sort of oppression sweepstakes, right? I think all critical race theories come from obviously that notion of really criticizing critical theory about how we have become, whatever our population or our community might be, marginalized with the realities that we encounter nowadays. And for over a number of years, right? A number of centuries and generations. Here are some reflections before we begin. So, I deliberately placed in orange the word mestiza, and because I want us to begin to think about the notion of mestizaje. And I'm not sure what our awareness may or may not be, but when we think of mestizaje, it's really that notion of being from two cultures, two races. And in many instances, there was judgment that was applied over, and there continues to be, with those of us who are of the mestizaje reality that are coming from two races. And in many instances, we're not accepted by either one of the parent races, to the point where we become outsiders, right? And it's really those outsider knowledges that really are the centerpiece, the core of critical race theories. And so when we think about mestiza knowledges, as Ansaldúa describes it in 87, we need to value the presence of voices of people of color. And we really need to re-envision those margins, right? The notion of being marginalized as places empowered by transformative resistance. We don't need to succumb to being those marginalized voices. We can use that position and that positionality, that intersectionality, as a place of power. And really, this is the context of the ALGE project, right? This is part of what we want to focus on, nurturing that type of knowledge for our students for now and in the future. Again, recognizing that being mestizo and not being valued perhaps on one side or the other is an interesting situation to be in. It's one where you're criticized because of language, you're criticized because of physical features, because of skin color, and you are placed on a socioeconomic ladder very quickly based on all those things. And again, or embraced by either of the parent races or the parent cultures. I wanted to point out, as I describe this particular slide, I wanted to point out this mural that's down on the bottom, because within the context of mestizaje, there is obviously the European side and the indigenous side. And I'm hoping to begin to support us all to begin to recognize that in the typical Chicano murals that we find within the United States, even here in New Mexico and Albuquerque, you will always, guaranteed, you will always find images and imagery of our indigenous connection and an embracing of that connection. And I'm hoping that from now on, whenever you look at some of those murals, you will begin to look and look for that imagery that embraces both of those sides and really values the indigenous side of our mestizaje. Here's another example of that. You can see Cesar Chavez here to the right. and again, all of the indigenous imagery that we choose to embrace. And I labeled this slide as tribal crit plus Latino crit, right? And what does it equal? Because that's really where we're drawing from. And that's why I put this Venn diagram up here, because really when we talk about those two crits, there's a new space that's formed. And that new space is the space of that mestizaje space. It's almost like the creation of a new race of peoples, and it was alluded to as far back as 1925 from an individual in Mexico, the name of Vasconcelos. He used to talk about the raza cósmica, and when he was speaking about that, he was speaking about how different races will begin to intermarry and really form a new race, right? And as part of that, there was a decision made by some of the Chicano movement to adopt this notion of la raza cósmica and take it as a label of who we truly are as Mexican Americans, who really draw from and pull from both sides of our histories and our cultural identities. And so, if you ever have heard somebody refer to themselves, or when I say somebody, I'm thinking about the community to which I belong as La Raza. I'm sure you've heard that term, and usually we're asking, when we talk about that, we're really alluding to the fact of whether or not a group or our group is related, right? If a specific person is related to our group, are they truly part of our community? And it has a much deeper sense than just community. It has a cultural resonance to it. It has a linguistic side as well, a deep cultural connection. So when we say, and it's a common question we'll ask, es raza, is that person raza or not? Or nosotros la raza, or la raza, we're talking about ourselves as a community that understandably comes with that's bicultural, that's biracial, and comes from a lot of different places. And I added other self-created labels here that are out there that include raza de bronce, the bronze race, and the golden race, right? And so sometimes we're not aware of how these groups and how this particular community calls itself. And that brings me now to a statement by Mendoza, a young woman who I believe is attempting to become a lawyer if she hasn't reached that already. But her comment was the following: by embracing myself as Chicana, I'm embracing a part of me that was meant to be destroyed and that should make me less than, a part that makes me unequal for having indigenous blood in the eyes of society, the law, and the government. But I refuse to let these colonialist goals dictate how I perceive myself and devalue the history and heritage that I was not intended to know. Again, as I was growing up, there was never, we need to question, who writes our history, right? There was never a conversation about mestizaje and how beautiful that mestizaje is and how we should really embrace that. The only place where I got that from was from my own grandmother, who would speak to me about our own connections to our indigenous communities and would really instill in me the recognition that indigenous people are my cousins, my first brothers, my first sisters. And it's such a unique reality to grow up in New Mexico with those types of conversations in our households and to really look at our connectedness in different ways. So really what we're proposing here is that when we think of tribal crit and Latino crit, we're proposing the need for a new crit, a Chicanx crit, a Chicano crit that really begins to speak to this notion of a fusion of cultures, a bicultural reality that exists and is typically ignored. So Jennifer Mendoza again goes on in her 2018 blog to say the following: Chicana means to me that I'm part of a community that chooses to go against the status quo of letting the ruling government or entity decide who I am and what parts of me are valid and worth protecting and recognizing under the law. Not letting myself be pushed into a one-size-fits-all category. It's those instances where we have to fill out either Latino or Hispanic, and all that does when we fill that out and fill in that blank, it only recognizes one side of who we are. And many of us are tired of only recognizing one side. It means continuing the fight that my Chicano community started, not to be ignored or remain invisible, no matter who tries to keep us that way. It's keeping the fight spirit of my ancestors alive and being proud of our legacy. So we propose, once again, the need for a Chicanx crit, and that really is connected to this notion of what we're proposing as far as the ALGE project, right? The Acequia Land Grant Education Project, something that speaks truth to history, speaks truth to our social, our cultural identities. As this young woman stated in her closing portion, she mentioned, I'm Chicana, I'm Indígena, I'm Indigenous, I'm proud, and I'm here. We don't turn our back on that. We value it. And again, you could see always the imagery and the connection we're trying to make with our Indigenous side, as well as that European side that can't be denied. And so when we come to this conversation of land and water, it's part of this. And yes, we know it's complicated. It's not easy. We are seen as, and are part of the legacy of the colonizer. We understand that. And it's not an easy thing to bear, but we understand it. We're connected to it. The truth is, we were not all Europeans, though, arriving in New Mexico. But through that notion of Paulo Freire, sometimes the oppressed become the oppressors. I understand that as well. I recognize it. We understand and embrace what we know of the Pueblo. To be honest, I think Pope had the right thing, did the right thing. And I think that there were also some communities that did advise some of the Chicano community that was here, the Mexicano community, to be probably start to move south, and let us know something was probably going to happen. I don't know if my specific ancestors were there at that time. I have no idea. I'd have to do some of that research, but it definitely is a reality, and I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. We also know that there was relative peace and an exchange after 1680 in New Mexico, up until 1848. We exchanged, how the notion of hunting, farming, food, music, and language, and you're probably wondering how. There are actually pieces of music within our communities here in New Mexico, and that music is called inditas. And in the indita tradition, the music is actually sung in Spanish, but it's played in a rhythm of a beat to a drum, and it's fascinating. And some of the topics include things like growing food, hunting. There was one specifically that I recall that focused on hunting buffalo out on the plains, and it's all in Spanish to the rhythm of a traditional indigenous song that speaks about the buffalo hunt with lances and bows and arrows, because in reality, that's all we had. We were so far on the edge and on the fringe that we didn't have access to any kind of guns or rifles until later on, when we were able to exchange for those as the United States started to get closer there in the plains, and we were starting to exchange across the way with St. Louis, et cetera, et cetera. But just fascinating to think how connected in many ways, and how little we know. And that's just an example of our stories, right? The stories that typically aren't shared. Another example of this is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? And just recognizing that within that treaty, the sovereignty of our indigenous communities was recognized, both as far as land and water and language, and how that needed to be valued and respected. There was an attempt to leave it that way, but obviously the rules and power dynamics of New Mexico changed. Our existence hasn't been perfect, we understand that, but let's also be thinking about who's written our history. For the last 170 years, and even prior to that, I would argue that in many instances, it's always been European-centric. Even in Mexico today, there are examples of that Eurocentric perspective that's applied to history, and kind of a marginalization of the indigenous realities of Mexico, which is so indigenous rich in its culture and in all that it does. So before we begin, once again, those injured by racism and other forms of oppression discover that they are not alone. And that's what we've discovered. And moreover, are part of a legacy of resistance to racism and the layers of racialized oppression. They become empowered participants, hearing their own stories and the stories of others, listening to how the arguments against them are framed, and learning to make the arguments to defend themselves. The ALGE project wishes to do this, which wishes to nurture this kind of knowledge. And for me, it really creates an opportunity for us as communities to begin to not just be accomplices, or not to create an alliance, but actually to be accomplices, right? To get our hands dirty in defending the land and water that's here, especially how, we're in the midst of climate change, and the need is even higher. So Ansandua, she asserts that our mestizaje theories, we create new categories from those, and that we really push out the existing ones because all those do is keep us marginalized. One of those theories and one of those pieces is really the idea of embracing aspirational capital. And that refers to the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future. The intent of the Acequia project is really to focus on our children, on the future, right? Generations down the line, and to make sure that they also are defenders of land and water and seeds and food sovereignty, and aren't looked upon as being something less because they're connected to land. Have we been lacking something though? Because when we think of the context of community cultural wealth, certainly there is aspirational capital and there's cultural capital, but I think in many instances we forget one out of all these capitals that are mentioned here. And the one that I throw out here is the idea of heritage and legacy, our connectedness to the land, to the environment, to water. And it's that sense of place, what we call in Spanish the querencia, right? It's a sense of being. When we're close to a place that we know where we can be who we are, and we could speak our language. And that language may be mixed with indigenous words as well as Spanish words, and we're okay with that, and we're valued. It's a place of home. And with that, I'd like to prepare the transition to Paula as we just think a little bit more about this idea of community cultural wealth. It involves a commitment to conduct research, to teach and develop schools that serve a larger purpose of struggling towards social and racial justice. It's all about telling truth, even though that truth is hard to hear and hard to bear. Historical truth and the potential to heal. That's what we're trying to push through this idea of the Acequia and land grant curriculum that's being developed. And so what do we hope to instill in our children? Love, language, culture, place, voice, and health, that mental health that we struggle for, that was alluded to in the session this morning, the opening session, thinking about these young people who are incarcerated, our indigenous young men and women together with our Mexicano, Chicano young men and women. There's a reason they're there. In many instances, they've forgotten who they are, and we've lost an opportunity to make those connections, and now we're struggling to make that with them. I suggest we do it much more proactively instead of reactively. We shouldn't be waiting until they're already incarcerated. With that stated, please, Paula, I would love for you to take the reins and to speak a little bit about, besides the above that's been mentioned, why the project?
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, Adrian, and I definitely want to explore it more when we get into questions. Again, thank you for allowing me to be here this morning, and it's really an honor for me to be here and to be able to share some background and current updates about our Acequia Land Grant Education Project. And before I do, I want to share with you some of my personal background to provide some context and let you know that where I'm from, how I came to this work, and how I got to this point with this particular body of work. I come from Mora. I've identified as a Chicana from a young age, mainly because of my family's involvement with the Chicano movement, and also was raised with a very deep appreciation for our neighboring indigenous communities. And even though I was taught to be proud of our indigenous roots and understanding the mestizaje, but also understanding and appreciating the sovereignty and distinct culture, language, and ways of being of neighboring tribes and pueblos. My mom grew up in Lumberton near Dulce and graduated from Dulce High School. And for us from Mora, our vacations were to go to Dulce. And that's what we did in the summers. And so I knew I would walk into that world, and it was a different world. Everyone in charge was Sicaria Pache, all the police, everybody was, the whole community was self-governed. And I knew that was something special, and I always enjoyed it. And I would go to the powwows and always treated as an honored guest. And so have that memory was very formative for me, to be able to claim Indigenous roots, but also not have to be of a particular community, and to appreciate and honor that our Indigenous communities continue to be strong and continue to be vibrant and have their own language and way of life. And was pleased and honored to be a guest there. And I still feel that way, because my primos hermanos, cousin brothers and sisters, are now running the town over there. So it's really, it's something I always appreciated. So I've always brought that to the work I do on land and water. I've been working with the New Mexico Acequia Association for about 24 years. And so I come to this work in education from an activist lens. And as an activist doing organizing, we have to do a lot of critical analysis about why we're having to struggle and to try to achieve self-determination. And from out of the work in protecting water, we have to define water outside of how dominant society defines water, and to affirm a cultural view of water as a community resource. And we have to be able to analyze why are we challenged, and why do we struggle to protect water, to be water defenders as a communal resource. And we get into manifest destiny and the commodification of water and capitalism. And that helps us understand why we have to organize in the way that we do to protect water as a community resource, clean water, small scale farming, subsistence farming, traditional ways of being with the land and being land-based people, and affirming that even though our global economy and the broader dominant society doesn't place value on these because it doesn't have economic value, that we can say it has value. We can affirm that for each other and for our children. And so that's been a lot of the work that we've done in the past 20 some years. And this work on the Acequia Land Grant Education Project stems out of, a need that's been discussed for years. And there are educators already that are doing some very meaningful work around culture, land and water and food. And we wanted to bring them together, and also with community leaders who are feeling a sense of urgency about the need to continue this legacy of organizing and defense and activism to protect water as a community resource. Because only then will these traditional land-based communities have a fighting chance, to survive and to have an identity into the future, because they're at risk of gentrification, of outmigration, all kinds of different things that challenge the social fabric of our communities. And so in terms of this project, it's really important to affirm that there's already important work going on, but it's really to convene community leaders and educators around a common goal of transforming our educational institutions to be more responsive to the needs in our communities, around cultivating the next generation of people who are going to defend our land and water and affirm our cultural values around food and land-based traditions. And in doing so, those are the partners in this project. Includes the Center for the Education Study of Diverse Populations, New Mexico Acequia Association, the land grants, when there are 3 different entities that encompass the land grant advocacy arm, but the primary partners, the UNM Land Grant Studies, and more recently, in the past couple of weeks, another partner just joined us, the Leadership Institute at Santa Fe Indian School, under the leadership of Regis Pecos, who, upon being invited to the convenings, really had so much to offer as far as recent policy work around education reform following the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. And so it's a robust set of partners, and we're in the process of having convenings now with educators, with community members, policymakers, and youth, in order to develop recommendations on how we start to build out a curriculum or a set of curricula that can be implemented in different educational settings, both school-based or community-based. And it really starts to spark really deep conversations about what do we mean by acequias and land grants, and the importance of placing those, as Adrian said in his presentation, within a critical race theory framework, and also in a way that's going to help decolonize the narrative about acequias and land grants. And this is very important for our communities, especially in this time when there's more awareness of recognizing First Peoples and honoring that Indigenous people were here first, and making sure that we're remembering that the oppression that happened because of colonialism, and that there is an ongoing need for reconciliation and better understanding. And in terms of how to decolonize the narrative, just to give an example, I think a lot of times we're taught that the start of acequias was the Spanish colonial era. And once, even if you don't come from a Chicana background like I do, and wanting to look for those indigenous roots, the historical record's pretty clear. When we've gone through legal proceedings with adjudication, our own historians find that there was a very sophisticated agricultural civilization here that had irrigation of different kinds, harvesting, ditch-based irrigation, like what we would think of as acequias. And it's really important to honor the indigenous ways of agriculture that were here for time immemorial, and not act as if acequias were the first thing on the scene that made irrigation possible. Acequias, as we know them, as sometimes framed as a Spanish institution, but still, recognize what was brought through that settlement process, in a way that's not erasing the indigenous story and indigenous history. So, same with land grants. And so in terms of putting those values out front, the process has been inclusive of Indigenous educators and community members so far. And even last night we had our first convening, and a couple of things really struck me about it in terms of the richness of the discussion. And for one thing, two of the participants, one from Okewinge and one from Kapowinge, we're talking where they every time they talk about acequias, they use their Tewa words, and each pueblo had a slightly different word. But for me, it was so striking and so meaningful to be in a conversation where we're using the word acequia and the Tewa word interchangeably in a conversation. And that's how it should be. And for those, for those of us that grew up in acequia communities, what an oversight for centuries not to have made the effort to learn what the Tewa words are for acequias, because they're there and they're being used, and there's a very rich tradition that's similar in a lot of ways, but also very deeply connected to every particular community that has them. And so that was really important, like as a like light bulb lighting up for me in the process. And also one of the Chicano participants I think said it really well, that part of what we want to do is have permiso. in that, like a lot of times in our culture, there's the idea of permiso and respeto, and respect and permission that go together when speaking. To be given the word, to be, if someone says to darte la palabra, it's also it's because you're given the permission and you're expected to do so respectfully. So this idea of la palabra, truth, respeto, permiso are very intertwined in the traditional Chicano communities, and asking and saying to our indigenous colleagues and from public and tribes, saying what we need is a way to talk about our history with respeto and permiso, and being able to tell that story in a way that acknowledges complicated parts of our history and ongoing conflicts, and also really lift up and affirm what's in common. And some of the themes that were in common, I'll get to those in a little bit, but I want to share with you some of the belief statements we worked on as partners. And then I'll share with you some of the themes that came out of our gathering last night. So for these 4 bullets, I think are an attempt to capture some of that. We believe that this project serves our communities and future generations by nurturing a legacy of land and water justice, food sovereignty, cultural integrity. We also believe our educational framework, including how we contextualize land grants and acequias, should be grounded in Indigenous perspectives on history, land and water tenure, and community, as well as critical consciousness on colonialism. We believe transformation is needed to serve our communities by preparing students to be active change agents in the areas of land, water, and food. And we believe the curriculum will strengthen cultural identity, elevate consciousness, and lead to public policy that is inclusive of the voices and knowledge of New Mexico's traditional land-based communities. And so these were statements that were shared at the start of our convening, and then we broke up into small groups, and people shared some of their thoughts about what do we think youth have to be taught about acequias and land grants, and how can the institutions of education be more supportive. And some of the key themes that were coming out in the group I was part of had to do with core values and the concept of belonging. And that's a real issue for I think for Chicanos and Chicanas, young people, around the idea of belonging. We have a concept in that in our culture of querencia. And at the same time, I think, even living myself in a rural community and having been raised here and been here for the past 20 years, other than my time in Albuquerque, which I loved, that I think we struggle with belonging for all kinds of reasons. It's hard to be proud of the Spanish narrative, and yet that's what we're always fed. And if you have a conscience, it's not easy to feel good about that, especially if you've had some Indigenous perspectives in your life. And then we're also smashed by the gentrification forces of different kinds of wealth coming into our economic wealth coming into our communities, and feeling the pressure that way. And it can feel like like a disappearing community sometimes if you're a land-based Chicano or Chicana. So I think the sense of belonging is real important to affirm historical roots, including the Indigenous side of our ancestry, and affirming the cultural traditions that we have as part of that legacy capital and heritage capital that Adrian spoke so eloquently about. There was a strong emphasis on experiential knowledge. How do we pass along knowledge through hands-on learning? There was a lot of interest in that, and the importance of language, and some of the participants were really excited about ideas of a language immersion in concert with experiential learning, and how meaningful it would be for even Chicano youth to get some Tewa immersion, and even just to pick up some key words, because one of our participants from Nambe Pueblo really got across the meaning of words and that that um, even learning a few words and learning the context behind it opens up a whole other view of the world, and that is can be a very important part of knowledge and how we connect to our communities and how we connect to our landscape. There's a lot of emphasis on teachers and the importance of having Native teachers, but also having teachers connected to traditional knowledge keepers in the community, and knowledge keepers about remedios, or herbs, and about how to grow food, about how we share water and manage the waters with equity, and people that know the commons, the mountains, the sierras, and can share that history. That those traditional knowledge keepers are just as important, and should be integrated into the educational experience of our youth. And so those were some key themes that were coming out of the project. I'm really encouraged by how it's going, and I really appreciate Adrian's role providing structure through Highlands University and combining it with our grassroots networks and connections, and the work we've already done in schools with certain educators. So that's some of the work in a nutshell, and I'm happy to be part of the conversation and answer questions or anything like that. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paula. That was a really nice presentation. Adrian, thank you for the foundations of coming to this. As I listen to this, when I listen to conversations like this, I listen to it as somebody who was born and raised at Taos. I'm just right up the road from all of you, and being someone who grew up with horses and cattle, and just growing up in Taos, right? You heat your house with heat. With wood. You live off of the land. So what you're talking about is very critical. And then I also listen to it as an Indigenous woman, but I also listen to it as an educator, a history educator. I taught at Rio Grande High School for a long time, and Taos High and everywhere. But anyway, so my comments are just going to be really quick. I see a great deal of potential for this in 5 basic ways. Number one, it's going to help us understand the complexity of history in New Mexico. It's going to have the potential for developing a critical consciousness among K-12 students in New Mexico. It's going to help us understand the complexity of identity and the demographic composition of New Mexico, because oftentimes people don't understand the different identities and how those distinctions are very important in seeing the distinctions, but also seeing the similarities that we have. There are some things that we share, but that's really difficult to navigate unless you really know where you're from, right? So like Paula so eloquently talked about going to Lumberton, for vacation, and, going to Dulce, and I just think that there's something there. There's a narrative there. There's a pedagogical utility to that understanding of who you are as being from Mora. So I also think that it's important. This project has potential for creating awareness of the sovereignty exercised by the 23 Native nations. Some people just see it as casinos or gas stations, and it's much more than that. It's cultural sovereignty. It's sovereignty in so many different ways that predate 1521, when Coronado first came to Mexico, and then Oñate came up in 1598. It predates all of that. I love the idea about discussing history with the concepts of respeto and permiso, to understand the complexity of history and to affirm and reaffirm coexistence. I think those are core values that I think are real important. So Paula, thank you for bringing that up and talking very eloquently about that. And then I also really like the idea of the link to food sovereignty. And maybe if we had more time, I would have liked to have seen that connection much more, but we all know it. I don't think this audience needs to understand it, because I think we all know it. I'm just looking at the people in the audience, but maybe for a future presentation, maybe you could maybe talk just a little bit more about the connection to food sovereignty, because that's important in the land of commodities, right? So, so anyway, we have about, so I understand from the chat that Adrian says he has a few more slides.
I could, I can finish the slides if
Okay.
you'd like, and then hopefully invite some recommendations from our lovely group, and field any questions, right, that you all may have for myself or Paula, just do that in a community fashion, right? Again, you don't know how thankful we are, Dr. Martinez, for your invitation here today, and the support that you provided, the guidance, whether you're aware of it or not. Even the words you just shared now are just so useful, and we're very appreciative. And so here, what I'm asking is, how does this invite all of us to take back our historical and present narratives? I think that's what both you and Paula were alluding to, the whole notion of permiso, the whole notion of, just really asking for that permission, and to do it with respect and honor, so that way we ultimately can aspire to the possibilities of the impact of a curriculum like this. And what should we not leave out of this curriculum? That's what I'm kind of curious about, especially from the group here today. And also, what is higher education's role in all of this? How does it begin to impact and influence our future teachers, so that way they see with the same lens that we all look at the possibilities here, they're able to see the possibilities as well, and not shun or marginalize the potential of this curriculum as an opportunity in a classroom, whether it be at elementary, middle, or high school. And how do we ensure that higher education is not only supporting the development of teachers that have a culturally responsive bent and a willingness to embrace this type of a curriculum, but also educational leaders that are willing to kind of push back against and suspend the pressures that they have to meet mandates specific to some of the measurements that are out there, understanding that this will provide us a much more solid footing, and will probably impact in tremendous ways the comfort level, the connectedness that students feel, and in that fashion ultimately impact what's going on in the classroom. One thing, as a takeaway here, is that when you think about land and water, it's connected to all of the disciplines. It brings in story, it brings in science, social studies. If we're using that lens of dividing up all of the disciplines, right? It brings in language, the development of language. It brings in culture. It brings in, a connectedness to an awareness of environmental issues. A lot of different things. It runs the span of all disciplines, including music and the arts, which is a fascinating thing to consider when we think about something as humble and yet as incredibly anchored and centered as a curriculum that focuses on the core of what keeps us alive, which is water and food, in a way that's sustaining, self-sustaining. And so with that, I thank you all, and I'm really curious, if you don't mind placing in the chat perhaps some of your thoughts about what are we lacking in a curriculum like this, and what perhaps is the role that higher education should play in this whole process. And please feel free to fill up the chat with some of those thoughts, and also to ask us any questions that you may have. We have approximately 10 minutes left. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. But yeah, we're definitely open. Any thoughts out there? Azul, be careful, because you know I'll call on you, man.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's, Azul is always the go-to person here, right? Okay, Azul, what do you think?
Oh, Pilay. Na cuando toca Azultic in class of Kamat in Yolotzin. My name is Azul, and it's really good to see my academic faces. I miss you all. very much. But in hearing this, you know, I want to tell a quick story because my work has been with language. You know, my passion is in language revitalization and maintenance of the heritage language. And I think for me, like when I'm hearing this, I'm thinking of creating that space, right? Of creating that space where the language can be used, right? And I'm going to go back and tell you a story because I lived on my daughter's reservation for 13 years or so. And I saw the transformation of space. So there are acequias, right? The men, during certain times of the year, the men get together and they go work. You know, they go clean the ditch, right? You know, they have, you know, marumas, you know, mayordomos in Espanol. And one of the shifts that I saw was in quote unquote advancing that ditch or the ditches, they started you know, putting concrete on them, right, to make them more efficient. And so then when it was time for our young ones to go out and do the ditch work and help or whatever, that time got cut in half, right? So instead of taking like 3-4 days, all of a sudden it was like one day, and then the next day we went to hang out and have lunch with the elders, right? But I saw, and that time I saw they stopped singing songs. They stopped using the language, right? Because that space just got shrunk. It just shrank, right? And for me, that was the importance. At that time, right? It's kind of like, oh man, what are we missing? What's going on? And so for me, in going back to this, right? We saw what's, you know, we were part of the movement for Standing Rock, right? And that was like a big opener. And it's like, wait a minute, we have issues here too in New Mexico, right? We have to fight Santolina. We have to, you know, educate ourselves or re-educate ourselves again to going back to, you know, farming, communal farming and that kind of thing. And so it's like, you know, this is the awakening, right? And like for me, I grounded in the Standing Rock efforts, but then also realize that we have to bring it home. We have to bring it to our communities, right? And understanding and respecting, right, our First Peoples, our First Nations and such. And so I share this because I think for me, from what I'm hearing, for me, it's like an opportunity to create space. And the space is to use the language, right? Paula, you know, when you were talking about acequia, using the acequia and it being interchangeable with the indigenous language, right? If I'm a guest in your land, I have to acknowledge how you talk to your land, right? How you talk to your elders, right? So the elder of the tree, I'm gonna, you know, greet it in that way as best as I can because I'm a guest, right? And I acknowledge that I'm a guest in these lands and I start off in that way. But I wanted to share that much, you know, it's exciting work. And I think more than anything, you know, once we ground our youth in the land, right, in water, then we can grow, right? The deeper the roots, the higher we can reach for the stars. Thank you.
Thanks, Asun. We have a couple of comments from Claudia Chacon wrote it in the chat. She said something that in responses, she said something that higher education curriculum should include or emphasize biculturalism is a blessing. Claudia, you want to add to that?
Sure thing. Hi, Glenaba.
Hi.
My name is Claudia Chacon, and I'm actually a first grade teacher here in Espanola. I was actually a student teacher at San Felipe Pueblo Elementary School, and I taught first grade there for about a year as a student teacher. So I kind of saw a lot of this curriculum stuff, like the issues that were happening. I was having to teach stuff, like create my own lessons to teach the kids because the curriculums weren't really meeting what I thought they needed. But the same stuff is happening here in Espanola. I'm seeing stuff where I feel like they should be learning a lot of stuff that's more connected to their cultures. And I think that if we could just talk about land and water and how we're all kind of a mixture of these different cultures already, and just talk about how it's making us stronger, I think that would be a good way to unify everyone.
Great, Claudia. Thank you for teaching. Appreciate it. I'm sure you're an awesome teacher. Shantika writes in the chat. She says, I am a 70-year, oh, you know, Shantika, you want to read it to us? I see that you're on. You want to read it for us, please? Your comment?
Yes. In listening to what's being said about picking up the former traditional cultures and teaching those, I had an experience since I say I'm a 70-year-old African American, and I've grown up from the old segregationist society in the old South into the era of today. The big things that's happening to me now that I'm looking back at what has been written by a lot of the Native American historians who have gone back and looked at the processes that were developed during the slavery system and have brought forward the histories, the narratives of former slaves that they can find, and looked at the courage under fire that these various slaves had. And now they're writing them into the history, because the history of African American presence in this country was written by the dominant society. And that's what I grew up with, is in thinking that, my role was subordinate to other roles. That this society, I was supposed to act the way I was expected to act. And this was my role. But now looking back at those histories and looking at the details of the courage and the intelligence and cunning that allowed those the slave groups to stay alive, these survival mechanisms. Now I can look back and say, oh, this is my history. The history of that was done by these brave people, and I have that courage. So that has made a big difference in my perception of self. And that's what I think you're talking about in your traditional knowledge, bringing that forward.
Yeah, Paula, I think you had a response to that.
I was just affirming that. I like what she said. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. This is a great topic, and I don't know how we can save all of this in the chat. You're talking to somebody who was born in 1959. I don't know any of this stuff. So maybe Adrian, as co-host, maybe you can save all of this in the chat. I don't know. There are a lot of good questions. But anyway, so Paula, would you like any closing remark?
I just want to express my gratitude for the work of all teachers and those of you that work with youth as your vocation and your life's work. My gratitude to you, and thank you for holding this space for this conversation. I was really honored to be part of it, and I really appreciated all the comments, and I wish we had more time, as always. But thank you so much.
Adrian?
Yeah, same here, without a doubt. I was taking pictures of the chat just in case. I know it's very easy to save the chat. It is a common part at the end of the whole presentation there with Zoom. But anyhow, I just want to, I guess, end with the following. As somebody who's not talked about too much anymore, and I think it's unfortunate, but Richard Oakes, which was part of the leadership with the Indigenous movement during the late 60s and early 70s, looked at one of his counterparts when he was going through Southern California and traveling through, and basically said, when are Mexican Americans going to realize they're Indigenous? And it's a fascinating comment to think about how individuals recognize the connections, the cultural connections that exist between these two communities. And again, I'm just so humbly thankful for the space that you created for us today. And I hope the conversation was useful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, everybody. And I hope all of you try to pop in and out as much as you can. I know we're asking for you to be here till 4. We know you can't, but You're always welcome. You just need to go back to your confirmation email and you can get right back into the sessions, okay? Everybody have a beautiful day and thank you for everything. Love you guys. Bye-bye.